So banks who only signed up net zero commitments last year ahead of COP26 in the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, potentially going to consider leaving. What on earth could be going on there? I'm James Vaccaro, Executive Director of Climate Safe Lending Network. I'm an advisory panel member of GFANZ, and obviously this is a very concerning development. Although one needs to consider what the history has been here, and the history in particular in the sort of the dialogue, the imagined dialogue between climate campaigners and in particular the big banks. Climate campaigners said, well, look, we think you're doing lots of bad things with your money, or our money. And the big banks had said, well, look, no, we care deeply about the planet. We do a lot of good things with money, and look at all these voluntary initiatives we've joined. Look at all these long-term targets, and we're spending a lot of time disclosing things. And campaigners say, but you're still funding far more harmful things than beneficial things. And the challenge back as to where the evidence is. And in the last few years, there's been a lot more evidence. NGOs have got much more access to databases, being able to stitch together databases to show all of the flows of finance, in particular to fossil fuels. Big banks will say, well, can't turn the taps off overnight. And then the campaigners say, well, it's not about turning taps off. You're literally funding more taps and turning more of them on. And what we know is that there's only so much room in the carbon budget for fossil fuel emissions, and it's all being used up. In fact, there's 7 times as much of fossil fuel reserves that have fit into the remaining 1.5 degrees carbon budget. Then banks say, well, you need to think about the social factors and communities of workers, who could be affected as part of a just transition. The campaigners would say, well, yes, that is absolutely right, but there's multiple communities affected here. It's not just workers, it's people who are suffering the consequences of pollution, of climate change in all different parts of the world, including the poorest parts of the world who've contributed the least to climate change. Does a just transition concept stretch to them? And then big banks say, well, look, it's not really an issue for us, it's for governments. And plain fact is, governments haven't aligned their policies yet to accelerate the transition, to which climate campaigners would say, but you influence governments, and some of you have been sort of lobbying directly against exactly the kind of policies and financial regulations which would accelerate the transition. Then it all goes a little bit quiet. And in a way, what's happened now is that as regulations, or in this particular case for GFANZ, the UN imposed kind of rules from Race to Zero get applied, then it becomes a little bit difficult, because those longer term actions, when it really comes to the implementation, become a little bit too difficult for some banks to be able to swallow. When we say banks, though, what do we mean? Banks are a complex system. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people within the financial institutions who are threatening to leave, knowing probably that they wouldn't be able to stay in if they were to try and stay unless they made significant changes. Thousands of people who are working in those banks who want that change to happen, who recognise that rather than being a cost and a pain, that transition has got a huge opportunity. As it turns out, there's a lot of folk who say, well, we're going to get you kicked out of those alliances, and those banks may be leaving anyway. What happens to them when they're in the shadows? Well, that's difficult to tell. What we do need is for every single group of financial institutions now to be working together, working internally, working with peers, to absolutely optimise what they can do within their transitions, planning transition plans and then activating it through doing things differently. How they show up with their clients has to be qualitatively different to how it's been in order to really accelerate transition. So there's a lot of nerves around, and it's going to be a difficult COP27 conversation. But I think that with the combined effort of people within banks reaching out, making the argument, demonstrating what's possible and showing the benefits of progressive transition, then we might be able to actually find that this could be a turning moment for the climate movement and for finance's role in being able to contribute positively towards this challenge. Thanks a lot. See you again next month.